When tapping into the refrigeration system, apply piercing valves to both of the red-painted service ports on the system. Apply it as close to the end of the pipe as possible with a flat location. Firmly tighten both piercing valves with a wrench. Attach the low side hose from the manifold to the low side service port routed into the compressor crankcase. Attach the high side hose of the manifold to the service port brazed into the filter dryer. Isolate both sides of the manifold. Now you can pierce the service ports. Once you loosen the needle valves, refrigerant will be able to flow through the hoses. Attach the charging hose on the manifold to an intrinsically safe recovery pump. Using a DOT-approved recovery cylinder, open the inlet valve. Power on the recovery machine and open both sides of the manifold. Operate the recovery pump for 10 to 15 minutes to remove as much refrigerant as possible. After 10 to 15 minutes, and before the recovery pumps can be shut off, isolate your manifold gauges. Close the valve on your DOT-approved recovery cylinder and turn off the recovery pump. The next step is to disconnect the charging hose of the manifold and connect it to an intrinsically safe hydrocarbon vacuum pump. Open the gas ballast and turn on the vacuum pump. Open the inlet port. Open the manifold valves attached to the system and monitor the micron gauge to achieve less than 500 microns. After you have achieved a vacuum level of less than 500 microns, isolate the manifold gauge by closing the inlet port on the valve on the vacuum pump. Shut off the vacuum pump and disconnect the charging hose. The next step is to perform a nitrogen sweep. Open the valve on the nitrogen tank. Start with the regulator open all the way and open the valve on the supply hose. Adjust the pressure until you feel a small flush of air. The goal is to introduce pressure between 5 and 15 psig into the system. Remove the charging hose from the manifold and attach the nitrogen hose. You can now open the nitrogen flow to the manifold. Sweep the nitrogen, introducing it to the high side and exiting the low side of the system. Open the high side of the manifold. Once you measure positive pressure, remove the low side hose. You should be able to feel nitrogen coming out of the piercing valve. Purge for approximately 5 to 10 minutes with nitrogen. With nitrogen flowing through the system, you can disconnect the saddle valve attached to the low side. Move the service port outside of the machine compartment for access. Using a pipe cutter, trim the low side service port as close to the piercing hole as possible. With nitrogen still flowing, deburr the cut. Elevate the pressure to blow out any burrs. Inspect and deburr again if required. The next step is to braze a Schrader port onto the service port of the sealed system. The two options are 1/4 inch or 3/16 inch diameter copper Schrader port. 3/16 will fit inside the tubing. If using a 1/4 inch copper Schrader port, a swedge will need to be performed on the copper of the Schrader fittings to fit over the piping of the service port. The paint must be removed using a Brillo pad, Scotch-Brite, or a wire brush. Remove the Schrader core from the stem and insert it into the service port. The next step is to braze on the Schrader port that was just installed. Protect the surrounding material by applying a wet rag. Begin to braze the joint using a neutral flame. Allow the copper to cool naturally. Once the copper and brass have cooled on the Schrader port, install the Schrader valve. Do not over-tighten. The nitrogen hose can now be transferred to the Schrader valve that was just installed. This will continue the flow of nitrogen. Repeat the same steps to install the Schrader port onto the other service port on the high side of the system. After the system is evacuated and the Schrader valves have been installed, you can remove or exchange any components. When doing so, it's recommended to introduce a low nitrogen pressure of approximately 5 psi to the system to reduce contaminants.